Greetings, you've landed at the VUC, IP Communications and VoIP Community. We would like to thank Simwood.com for their support. Simwood can turn you as a developer into a telco. Our hosted PBX is from onsip.com, and you can go to getonsip.com for a URL people can click to call you. We've been privileged over the last 5 years to be using the best conference bridge on the planet. Yes, I'm talking about zipdx.com, full color, full featured, full HD conference bridge. Our website, vuc.me on the webs, hosted by bluehost.com. And our worldwide local rate dial-ins are from voxbone.com. Okay, welcome to VUC 531. Can you believe it? 531 episodes, and this is the 531st. How about that? We've got a great panel with us today, as always. However, Mr. James Bodie, who's a regular, is on a train. He does appear to be moving and having video right now. I'm trying to get my own video on. Here we go. We also want to welcome Rafe Blandford, who James invited. Rafe, great to have you with us. I want to just mention a couple of things quickly from friends. Of course, Andy Smith's with us and Michael Graves, and who knows who might drop in. Wanted to tell you quickly that, remind you that there's a TAD Hack in London, 11th and 12th of April, and of course there's a TAD Hack going on in mid-June. I don't have that in front of me, but it's far enough away where we can look for that. And I and several other regulars, in fact, most of the regulars will be at Camellia World, which is May 27th to 29th in Berlin. So come to Berlin if you're anywhere near it, or if you feel like, you know, maybe having a second honeymoon. Bring your wife to Berlin. It's a great place to visit. And then come and say hello at Camellia World. Okay, so back to the topic at hand. I don't know, James is now fixed image, so we will we'll throw it over to Rafe right away. And no, he's not fixed image, but anyway, James, you chime in when you want. Rafe, you were at Mobile World Congress. I keep saying conference; it's Congress. So we're anxious to hear your impressions, and I don't want to interview you. I'd just like to have you say what you would like to say, and we'll get the discussion going. Okay?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to say about it is it was bigger than ever before with 90,000 people. So it's quite difficult to talk about it in a summary way because there are lots of different areas. I always go there to try and understand what's going on in the industry. I tend to be more focused on the consumer side and some of the device stuff, but also advertising and some of the media services. What struck me, I think, this time round was we were seeing a kind of, it was one of those leap years where you see a lot of the maturing technologies. We've had cars, we've had health, we've had lots of sectors come into Mobile World Congress in the last few years, and they're starting to mature and actually produce products. And I think my key theme out of MWC was actually one of partnership. For an organisation like the GSMA, it's always been based around operators, and it's been quite a siloed conference in some elements, but increasingly we're seeing partnerships happen in order to deliver products and services in a more vertically integrated manner. And you can look at some of the big announcements and see that, for example, HTC with Under Armour and their wearable device, but the more interesting one is probably Valve and the HTC Vive, which is a VR headset. VR was one of the big themes at the conference this year. A lot of grey men in suits wearing VR headsets, which always makes for an entertaining picture, but actually starting to get into the sectors other than entertainment. And for example, Nokia's HERE team had a demo showing off their data, and then Ericsson had a pretty amazing demo using LTE and an Oculus Rift headset to actually be able to drive a dumper truck, or rather a digger, on the other side of the world live. It's not often you see that kind of demo actually for that physical telepresence. Was very impressive indeed, something that's been promised for a while. And of course it's always the big handsets announcement, Samsung stepping up with something like the S6, but if I was going to pick out a handset theme, it would be more about the mid-tier devices. And I think there's a shifting mix in the portfolio of devices. We're seeing a lot more in the mid-tier, and I think that will be reflected in sales in 2015. which actually means we'll see more people with more capable devices. And we've already had the smartphone majority reach, but now we're actually getting more capable smartphone devices, which obviously has implications for the software and services running on top of them. A good example of that are the Sony Xperia M4, but also what Microsoft was doing with their Lumia devices, particularly the Lumia 640 XL stood out, including particularly because it's for about £180 or $200. You're seeing a very good, capable smartphone, and they're also bundling Office 365 with it. So thought that was a strong offering. But I'm happy to talk about any particular element. As I say, it's a very, very broad show.
Yeah, a couple of questions. We were talking earlier before we started this, and I heard about two things. One was that one of the Samsung phones is like $1,100 or £1,000 or something. There was an expensive device. Is that the one you just mentioned, the Galaxy?
Yeah, so that's the Samsung S6, which actually comes in 3 different variants depending on how big an internal capacity you have. And then there's actually 2 different types of the S6. One, the Edge edition, which has curved screen down both sides, and one kind of a more standard version. And the high-end S6 Edge with 128 gigabytes of RAM, yes, comes in at about $1,100. It's actually very similar, I think, to the iPhone 6 Plus pricing model. If you get the high-end one of those, it can go up to that mark. And so Samsung was very much copying the Apple model in that respect on pricing.
And the other thing I mentioned on the other end of the scale was, and I don't know that this was at the Congress, by the way, but I had heard that there's the Motorola has this Motorola E. Was that mentioned even there, or maybe this is separate and doesn't have to do with it?
Well, it was on display at the conference. I'm not sure exactly when it was announced, but it's kind of their second generation of their very affordable handset. Going well under the sort of the $100 mark. For, as I say, this is kind of chimes in with the mid-tier theme I was talking about. We've seen a lot of cheap Android devices in the last 3 or 4 years, but frankly, they've actually not been very good. What we've seen with devices like the Motorola G and then particularly the Motorola E, similar things from Nokia and Microsoft with the kind of the Lumia 430, for example, is very capable low-end devices which still have the kind of the full feature specification, and so effectively you can buy 5 or 6 of those devices for the price of one flagship, and for enterprise smartphone usage, that becomes very interesting.
And obviously, I mean, just to complete the phrase, obviously the rest of the world who isn't saturated in the market, I mean, you need the very, very inexpensive side. I'm sorry, that was James. Who was trying to speak there? No, I thought I heard something. Okay, that was the most expensive and one of the least expensive. I kind of lost my train because I thought that I was talking over. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. I mean, while we're on the subject of handsets, I mean, there's Jolla, there's Firefox, and the Ubuntu phones. Now, did you get a chance to look at any of those, and what were your thoughts?
I did. I was talking to Mark Dillon, who's the CEO of Yola, about the phone, and obviously it's actually still their old phone that they're selling, but they were showing off their new tablet device. But it's pretty clear they've got another phone coming, and Ubuntu were showing off I think it's the BQ phone, which is the low-end one, but also the kind of the Meizu phone from China, which I think attracting a lot of interest and certainly was generating media attention. You also see the Tizen phones and the Firefox phones. All of them, though, are relatively small sales numbers, and because of the importance of ecosystems, both apps and services, it's difficult to see how those platforms break into the sort of the top 3 of Android, iOS, and Windows Phone. Nonetheless, there's definitely a place for them, and I think it's quite possible to effectively run a kind of a boutique business selling those phones and for special interests or for special type of devices, maybe industry or enterprise applications, or just because there's a cost factor involved, particularly something like the Firefox phones getting down to as cheap as sort of $20 or so. I think we'll continue to see that. And to take a current example from the market, actually BlackBerry is very much like that. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to sell vast numbers of phones. They announced a new device, kind of a full touchscreen device at the show, and kind of showed off another curved slider device. So I actually think that we're going to stop talking about what will become a 4 platform, will it break in. There will just be a whole range of these, if I can call them boutique or small-scale platforms for particular use types. And that might be enterprise, as with BlackBerry, or something like Yola, which very much appeals to the open source community and can be very strong in somewhere like China because of the restrictions you have with Google services on Android in that market. So they are going to be market specific. I don't really see them emerging as another global platform though.
Do you see them in terms of capability similar to the other mid-range phones?
In terms of the kind of the core capability on the platforms themselves, for the most part, I think there's always going to be some gaps, and they do take a while to mature these platforms. But Ubuntu was looking pretty fully featured, but they often take a kind of a different philosophy. Firefox is the sort of the more web-led solution, but so much of the value now in those kind of, especially the smartphone ecosystem, actually sits in the apps and the services. Actually, I think the platforms are becoming increasingly irrelevant for consumers and enterprise. When you're buying a phone, you don't really think about the platform. You think about what you want to do with it, and that's something that's happened over the last decade, and we're just seeing that trend more and more. And so that very fact actually allows these additional platforms to exist because they can create the necessary service or ecosystem in a small way, not the global sense, to actually remain viable. But for the consumer market, no, they aren't as capable because they don't have the same array of apps and services. So it is tricky to see them scaling in any way. But it's such a huge market, you can actually still create a pretty viable business even with a relatively specialist product.
I'm sure James has got a comment or two here since he spent most of the MWC on the Ubuntu stand.
Yeah.
No.
He does, but he's blocked. Michael wants to ask something, and Michael, if you could mention what Jim said on IRC, we'll do it all in one block.
Sure.
No, you can't.
Jim is mentioning the BlackBerry targeting niche markets, which good luck to them. I'm sure they'll achieve some success. Was there any BlackBerry presence there to mention? And also, the other thing I'm curious about is whether or not Google's Project Aria got any mind share at the show.
Okay, so BlackBerry did hold a press event there, but they didn't have a stand. So as I say, they announced the new phone, which I'm sorry has slipped my mind in the kind of the post MWC haze.
10.
That's right, and they did show off kind of or preview another device. But actually, the most interesting thing that BlackBerry announced was actually having Samsung on the stage at their press conference, and they're going to integrate their software and services into the Knox enterprise platform. And that, to me, is a pretty big deal, having a Samsung executive at a BlackBerry press conference. I think that's quite telling for the future of BlackBerry. And what was the second question? Forgive me.
Aria.
Aria.
Yes.
Aria.
Yeah, I think it's still early days for Aria, but there were a couple of the modules on display. There was it's essentially a French company, although with Chinese manufacturer, Yes, was showing off about 100 different Aria modules for everything from a kind of headphone jack to NFC to a credit card type chip. They say they're going to take about 10 to 20 to the market. They're in the prototype stage at the moment. Toshiba were also showing off a few of the camera modules. They've got about 3 or 4 different modules for those, and so there was a bit of buzz about it in the background, but I think Google was really holding off on the major announcement. It was really happenstance that we heard about them, where partners who are creating these modules were very keen to get a bit of attention, and so we're therefore showing them off. I think the big reveal will be later in the year, probably June or July.
Okay, so what? No, Michael, were you done?
Well, if I had another question, I would ask about sort of scuttlebutt on the floor about Google's move into being an MVNO, and more recently there was, I think it was just this morning, saying that it could be like device specific and like right down to being only the latest Nexus phone. Is there any truth to that?
Your guess is as good as mine. I mean, yes, there was a lot of chat about it. I mean, anytime Google makes a move like that, everyone starts talking. I think the sort of general conclusion that people came to was they're going to do it for experimental reasons, exactly the same reason they did their Nexus devices. And so for the operators, in one sense, it's not a major threat. It's really Google wants to learn about how this space works. Of course, they might make a decision to go bigger later on. But it was the rumors about just specific devices. You say the new Nexus, which is probably going to be made by Huawei, the Chinese company. and there was, obviously talk about how it would be implemented in terms of, the Wi-Fi. But yeah, there was nothing actually concrete. Google, in some ways, has a low-key presence at MWC. It's obviously endemic to the conference because of Android, and there are Android pins and Android Droid logos everywhere. But Google itself doesn't have a major stand.
Part of me wonders whether this is a sort of a try before you buy strategy, where they can tinker with being an MVNO, and then they're big enough that if they decided, well, we'll just buy Sprint or we'll buy T-Mobile or something like that, because both of these are carriers who are sort of, well, not so much Sprint anymore, but T-Mobile's definitely been shopped around a lot. So.
Yeah, it's a distinct possibility. I would actually expect Google to get into the market somewhere other than the US, just because the US is rather an oddball market in some ways, and so if it was going to experiment and do something interesting, it might well look outside the US. But yeah, of course, there's always a possibility they could make a play like that. I don't think it's in their particular interest to do so for the time being. I don't think owning an operator would sort of help with their core mission or their core business strategy. But I'm going to be watching it with just as much interest as everybody else, because it's kind of fun to speculate.
Okay, I wanted to ask another question. Oh, sorry, Michael, if you.
No, go ahead.
No, it was a simple, slightly change of topic, but every time I've seen product placement of Microsoft Phone, whatever that is, Lumia, I guess it is, right?
That's right.
Whenever you see that on TV shows or whatever, it actually looks fantastic. And I've heard a few people say, boy, that's a great phone. I guess it just doesn't have any apps, but I was curious whether you have any hands-on with those phones, whether you saw them and whether they did. Was Microsoft there in a big way?
Yeah, Microsoft was there in a very big way. I actually rather like Windows Phone devices. It's what I carry as my kind of personal daily driver. I mean, like everyone else, I kind of carry an iOS and Android device as well. I was very impressed with the 640 and the 640 XL, which are the two handsets they announced. They were also looking ahead to Windows 10, which will bring phone and desktop much closer together, and it's this idea of one Microsoft. But what was also, I think, fascinating about it was they also announced a keyboard, and you sort of go, why is that interesting? Actually, it had an Android, an iOS, and a Windows logo on it, this keyboard, because it was universal, and it really speaks to Microsoft's new strategy. They're both a software and now a hardware player, but they're not looking to do it just within their own ecosystem. They're looking to be available on all platforms. The idea is, of course, it will be first and best on Windows, and they announced, or rather previewed, Office as a universal app on both phones. And I think the 640 XL is one of those very unusual handsets that appeals both to the kind of the young market because it's good value and has that Office 365 bundle, but also will speak to enterprises as well because it's got that kind of Office and that tie into the Microsoft platform, and particularly the cloud services as well. And at the same time is going to be about $200, €200, and that's a much easier proposition to sell in versus buying everyone an iPhone at $600 or $700. And I think that's going to be something we'll see Microsoft with Windows 10 become very strong in the enterprise this year. They're still relatively small. They've improved the app situation remarkably in the last 12 months or so, but there's always going to be room for improvement. And as the third platform, any developer or any service company I talk to, they're always developing Windows Phone as the third option, and it's going to be very hard for Microsoft to escape from that. But because they've now got to a scale where most of the major apps are there, actually for 90% of consumers, it's not a problem. For the 10% that are power users, and actually these are the ones that tend to write about and talk about smartphones, there's still this kind of idea there's a horrible app gap. For the average consumer, it really doesn't exist in the same way that it did 2 years ago.
Well, yeah, I think that in the case of, say, Apple, there are still apps that come out that are iOS only, and then people are moved to develop Android, and of course Microsoft is way down on the list. But a lot of this is specialized stuff. Like one of the things that comes to mind is that there's a lot of recording studio, a lot of audio, a lot of artistic stuff on iOS that the people who develop it, and they're brilliant apps from what I've seen, but nobody feels that there's a market enough in Android, and certainly Microsoft's totally off the scope. But your average person who wasn't at MWC and who doesn't even know what that is using word processing and messaging and like 5 other things, and that's the end of it. So in a way, the apps thing it's kind of fake, I can't think of how to express this, but kind of a false impression of how things are. There's this huge, how many, 30,000 apps or 100,000 apps? But I mean, what are they, the fart app, the buzz when there's just so much superfluous stuff out there. What are
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, iOS and Android have now passed 1 million apps, but the reality is that most people, if you look at the surveys, only ever install about 15 apps, and they only actually use 6 regularly. And by the time you've covered off things like Facebook and WhatsApp, for the average person, it's just it really is a handful of apps, and so a lot of attention is paid to it. And I think because a lot of the VC money does go into those kind of app startups, and it's seen as the way to address things, and that's becoming even more true with smart home and wearables. But the truth is, people spend plenty of time doing other things with their phone, and so you look at those 6 apps, you pair it with the browser, and actually there's very little to choose between the major platforms when you just look at that functionality. But there is this, it's a familiarity principle thing. People like Android and iOS, and a Windows Phone, I think, is probably unfairly done down for the apps. When it has advantages on its side, if you kind of look at the integration with Microsoft, for some people that's a critical factor.
And so I guess this would be really attractive to enterprise. Now, I don't know how all in the different countries in the world. I mean, you're in the UK, right? So
that's right.
In the UK, how does that work? Is it bring your own device, or is it here's your Windows phone, or here's your Android phone or iPhone? How does that in general in the UK?
In the UK, I think we're quite similar to the US in that it's very mixed still. You have to look at the specific sectors, and so things like banking or legal financial still tends to be company supplied devices. But there has been a massive increase in bring your own device. The number of people doing that has increased, and actually created a whole set of device management problems for companies. I think it also depends on whether the company has line of business apps in terms of things like inventory or fleet management. But it's certainly not uncommon for people to have 2 devices, and actually the issue can be sometimes getting the work email onto your personal device, because people prefer to carry one. But I don't think the UK is particularly unique. I mean, James may be able to offer some insight onto that as well.
And I think he's actually in a position to speak now, James. Oops. So this is so painful. See him. Look at James. I'm gonna put him in full screen for the recording. Oh no, there's nothing. He doesn't even have any video. All right, sorry about that. Anybody else have any comments? We have a bunch of people on ZipDX. If anyone has any questions, I saw Maxim earlier. I don't see him anymore, but several people. Neil, any of you guys have any questions who weren't there?
I have plenty more. I have several different subjects I'd love to look at. Oh, there's a James back with video.
James, say something quick. Oh my, he can't get in. Poor James.
Well, I'm trying to join you. I'm trying very hard.
You're good.
This is going to be hilarious looking back on the recording. But anyway, I'm glad we got Rafe in to fill in, because it would have been a train wreck without Rafe. So thank you, Rafe.
Agreed. So Andy, fill in the breach, fill in the gap.
Okay, so we talked about what's there now and what's new for this year, but of course Qualcomm will have been there, and undoubtedly they will have had something on their stand. I don't know whether you managed to look at what Qualcomm are offering, and we might see in phones next year or maybe the year after.
Yeah, absolutely. They announced the Snapdragon 820, which is kind of the latest in their family of processors. It's always difficult to pick out one thing, but one of my favorite things that Qualcomm was showing off was their new fingerprint technology. It's actually a result of an acquisition, and it's a touch fingerprint sensor, but the difference is it's using ultrasonics, and that means that it's actually more capable and theoretically more secure as well. But the really big deal is that it can scan through glass, plastic, and metal. So it means that fingerprint sensors are going to have much less of a restriction on the design of the phones in the future. It's also cheaper, so we're likely to see it in a greater number of products, and it's not quite so encumbered by some of the IP, as has been the problem recently. So I think next year we'll actually see fingerprints on sensors on a lot more phones. This time around it was really only the S6, and actually they have improved their kind of scroll fingerprint sensor. It's now a touch one. on the back on the camera next to the camera. They were also showing off some of their Vuforia technology. The one that particularly caught my attention was around being able to use the camera in combination with a kind of IR sensor to measure depth, and so you can theoretically build up 3D models just using a phone and then view them in virtual reality. The other Qualcomm technology, which has actually started arriving, is Quick Charge 2.0, the ability to recharge your phone up to about 40% in just 30 minutes. That's in the Samsung S6 as well as the HTC One M9. But in terms of the new stuff, yes, the Snapdragon 820 and some of the imaging capabilities it has, and some of the voice features as well in that, are going to be the things that once it starts getting sampled, it will be in next year's flagships. And as you say, looking at the silicon now always gives you a good clue for 12 months ahead.
Sorry, can I dive in here, because I got a bit of bandwidth once. There were something else on the Qualcomm stand which is incredibly interesting, where the chipset supporting LTE-U, the U being for unlicensed. And what we're about to see are a whole raft of new small cell devices which use unlicensed bands, in particular the 5 gig, an extended 5 gig band tacked on the top end of the Wi-Fi band. What that means is that networks will be able to unload users off onto the small cells for really high speed throughput when you're at home or in the office. So we're going to see a lot more of those, and hopefully be very, very low cost. Elsewhere in Hall 5, we had demonstrations of the Lime Microsystem software-defined radio module, with which, in fact, that's the module that's being used in the crikey, it's all going on.
Who did I mute? James?
Rafe.
I muted Rafe.
Free top box. Oh, yeah, well done.
Go, James. No, I didn't mute you. I was kidding.
I'm still here, aren't I? Yeah.
Yeah.
Used, I think, in the betas, they're available for about £15 only. So that's £15 for an LTE base station radio module, which is unbelievable. So what that means is we're going to see lots and lots of them in the future, and that'll change the way we operate at home. And I'm probably going to drop out about now, actually, because I'm running out of Wilton.
Okay, well, come back when you can. Rafe,
I'll be back.
I had to mute you so that we didn't hear your whatever the phone call was. So you have to unmute yourself. I can't do it. But I wanted to ask you a question, which was, did you see? Okay, so every cell phone, every smartphone now has a certain number of things. You can't buy one without Bluetooth that I know of. You can't buy one without a camera, really. Was there any hardware or new features? NFC. Make the list of about 10 things that almost every phone has. Some of them have fingerprinting. Was there anything new? Any actual new technology that anybody showed that's like was totally not in that list that we know?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't think so. I think most of it was incremental. I mean, James has mentioned LTE-U, and actually the interesting thing there is we're seeing announcements from Nokia and Alcatel-Lucent about getting that technology into their stations very quickly. So I think that's going to happen very quickly. But what we do see are the incremental things. And so, for example, there's a whole bunch of companies showing off nano coatings. We've already seen those used to make phones waterproof, but now you can actually make them so basically you don't have to clean your screen, and they're sort of anti-fouling nano coatings. So we'll see that sort of thing come in more and more. And it's not anything dramatically new, but it does make a big difference. I mean, I would compare it to the way that sapphire glasses started to be used on the cameras to protect the lenses. It just makes the phones a little bit more robust. In terms of that materials technology, HTC are still doing their unibody metal devices, but they're now doing a double anodization process, and so they actually get 2 different colors of metal on their phones, and it's becoming much more like jewelry. And actually that's something more generally across the phones. They're kind of using more and more advanced construction techniques. But in terms of an interesting bit of technology, there was a company called Simulus there who were actually showing off a programmable SIM. And as far as I'm aware, it was the first GSM phone not to have a SIM card slot in it. And so that was kind of an interesting piece of technology. I think obviously various gatekeepers in the way of that going mainstream, but it was just a 2 millimeter chip that was basically representing the SIM, and of course for machine to machine that makes perfect sense. I don't think you necessarily see that in the wild, but it was still something I thought was very interesting.
You have to wonder whether no one will do retina scan at some point.
I mean, certainly. I mean, there were various kind of eye tracking and eye security things. They tend not to be the full retina thing because that's harder to achieve with the front-facing camera. But there were a couple of companies attempting to differentiate their products by having eye unlock, which is just which has to be said by day 4 MWC when everyone's looking a bit bloodshot. The demo stopped working. So biometrics is actually with the fingerprints and things like iris recognition. We're going to see a lot more of that. And so if you were going to put one thing on what's going to be on next year's handsets, to answer your question, I think it's going to be biometrics in a way that isn't just on the high end. It will be on the mid-tier. Of course, that's going to be driven by the rise in mobile payments.
Right. We don't even want to necessarily get into. I mean, maybe welcome.
No,
but not a thing that is that fascinating. On the other hand, what about the wearables? Was there much accessories? Watches, but there are obviously other things maybe that are in the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Apple announced their watch event just before MWC, which got everyone talking, of course. I'm just trying to remember. I think I counted something like 10 different smartwatch launches and something in the order of 50 wearable launches at MWC. Some of them from very small companies, some of them from quite big companies. For example, LG was showing off their Urbane smartwatch, one of the more attractive ones I've seen. Huawei announced their first Google Gear device, Google Wear device with a round form factor. Pebble was showing off its smart watch strap, so that's a really interesting move. It's actually making the strap itself wearable and kind of a pluggable accessory. It will help keep their devices current for a longer amount of time. HTC announced the Grip, which is a partnership with Under Armour, which is kind of a bit like the Nike Fuel Band. It's aimed at kind of athletes rather than the occasional trackers. But yes, you walk through any hall and you will see numerous wearables. We've always talked about how smartphones become commoditized, and that continued. The cheapest phone I think was $20, and that's a retail price, not just the kind of the market price. And wearables was exactly the same thing. 100+ companies showing off wearables. Quite hard to differentiate, but a lot of them becoming more specialist. And it was really a continuation of something I saw last year at IFA and CES. And some of them you frankly wonder how they're going to sell in significant numbers, because it's still dominated by, in the terms of the wellness category, the big guys like Jawbone or Fitbit. But the specialist ones do get interesting, particularly if we think about the enterprise sector around security and kind of the replacement for smart cards or for badges. So yeah, absolutely, there was a lot there. I don't know if there's a particular area I'd like to focus on.
Well, actually, I did have a question, and I can't remember the name of the Chinese company who specializes in smartphones that can control the stuff on your house. Remind me who that. I think you know who I'm talking about.
I think do you mean Xiaomi?
Yeah, right. So were they there in a big way, or not at all, or?
They weren't there in a big way. I mean, there's always speculation as to why. I would suggest it would be because if they brought their phones in to Spain, they would be impounded for IP violations, and perhaps that's a little unfair. I think they're still concentrating on the Chinese and the Asian markets, and MWC, despite being a global event, is still really Europe and US focused. But they did announce kind of a GoPro accessory equivalent for about $30, so obviously undercutting the GoPro pricing fairly significantly. And they have their wearable bands. Their My Band retails about $13, obviously a lot less than the $100 typically charged by some of the other players. And so that Chinese disruption will happen in wearables just as it has happened in smartphones.
But do you think that these people, because when I heard about this, I thought, well, that's interesting. This is this one company who's what I heard, and I don't remember if I heard somebody talking about this, but it had to do with like the fact that they pair with air conditioners and all kinds of appliances that really don't need intelligence, and you control your whole all of the Internet of Things around you, and that yes, they're totally Chinese now, but that someday maybe they will decide to go worldwide or be able to for some reason. This seems to me to be a big idea for the future, though. Not just wearables, but the phone being a complete control center. After all, people are doing that now, but in a disparate way. They're not controlling your whole house; they're controlling your lights or something. Was there much?
I don't think that's limited to just the Chinese companies. The idea of the smartphone as your kind of the heart of your digital landscape and controlling the smart home was very much apparent. There's a US company called Peel who has traditionally done kind of TV remote control via an IR blaster. They announced a new version of their product which is now able to control air conditioners, the Dyson Airblade, as well as things like the Philips Hue light bulbs, which are kind of smart Wi-Fi light bulbs. Those companies were very much present at MWC. I think probably less so than some of the other shows I've been to. But yes, I mean, absolutely. And the idea that the smartphone will be the control mechanism for them is now well established. The interesting part of that is there going to be a hardware hub for them? Or is it going to be all done through software on the phone? And there is this issue, particularly with the smart home, is most people don't actually carry their phone around the home with them. They tend to put it down on a table somewhere. And so the kind of question becomes, does it then be controlled by a smartwatch? And they haven't got the market penetration to make it really viable yet. And so it's very much a developing space. And of course, where does the smartness line there? You referred to the kind of dumb device, and you're absolutely right. Really, to really have this stuff take off, you don't really want to be doing remote control. It's not that exciting being able to switch your light bulbs on and off from your phone or put the kettle on. You really want what's referred to as delegated decisions, and so it's you walk into the home, and your light bulb switch on through geofencing or something like that, or it turns down the heating because it knows that you're going to be away for a week because it's looked in your calendar, or things like that. And that delegated decision making or agency of smartphones it does tie in with kind of the artificial intelligence, is very much where the kind of smart home thinking is for the next kind of 5 years. At the moment, there is still this fight to get as many connected devices as possible, and who's going to control them. Nest is doing the works with Nest system with Google. Samsung has Smart Things. Apple has HomeKit, and it's like the early days of kind of any technology. There's multiple people fighting to see who will be in control, and there is a big question, obviously, around trust and security, because especially in the home, people are going to have that, I think, at the forefront of their minds, and it's very valuable data because to be able to collect information about what people are doing, in the privacy of their own home and start making interesting decisions. But to give you just one example of that, Works with Nest is able to control your appliances and either turn them off or just turn down the heating. That gets really interesting when you apply that at scale, because if you turn off all the fridges before the end of a big football match, just for 5 minutes, it has no impact on them. When everyone gets up to turn on the kettle or make a cup of tea, and this is a bit of a British example, there's a spike in the energy demand. But if you've turned off all the fridges 5 minutes before, it flattens out the energy spike, and managing that kind of thing at the macro level is what the smart home will enable. And of course, that ties into the idea of smart city and smart grids. And that's the sort of thing we're talking about. But as I say, early days, and at the moment, you just sort of get wowed by the fact the light bulbs turn on when you walk in the door.
I'm sort of presuming, though, that in this sort of situation, you're talking about the smartphone as a controller of another controller, which is actually doing everything else that's in the home. And in such terms, I know that Microsoft with Windows 10 are producing it for the Raspberry Pi 2, and they're producing it specifically and as a stated aim of getting people to develop for Windows for the Internet of Things, and exactly the same for Ubuntu Core Snappy. They're both pushing and looking at the Raspberry Pi 2 and other such small factor boards as being the central controller that everything else talks to within the house.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there is this idea of hardware hub, but there is this suggestion that it will also be software-based and everything will live in the cloud and it will just talk to each individual device. I don't think it's clear which solution will win, but you're absolutely right. There are a whole bunch of boards around, and ST Micro, Intel, that they were announcing actually a partnership with ARM over an Internet of Things platform, and Qualcomm actually also does things, and they tend to do things at the higher level. And you've also got the industrial applications with the companies like Jasper doing things in that space. Yeah, it's difficult to predict. My personal feeling on this is that we will have a bunch of hardware hubs within the home, and they will be connected together with Zigbee and various other radio technologies, and some of it will be unlicensed stuff, some of it will be over Wi-Fi, there will be kind of cellular GSM machine to machine, and ultimately we'll probably have to have some kind of some software or service sitting in the cloud that ties all of this together. So I think there'll be hardware hubs kind of sitting on the edge of the network, and then there'll be a kind of overall software control in the middle with the smartphone, smartwatches, and other wearables, or your smart TV acting as kind of control services for all of this. But yeah, early days, so it's kind of difficult to make strong
opportunities for everyone, more or less.
I would vote personally for not having all these devices connected to the network, or at least the internet, and not maybe not on Wi-Fi either. But there's no current technology out there, well, infrared or something. But maybe it would be better if these things were wired somehow into the electrical system, and that they were not hackable from outside in any physically, you know, that they just couldn't. Michael has a question, but before, I just want to make another comment that was that, sure, there's a big movement to the smartphone being the control hub, but or the control of a lot of things in the home. Then you get in your car, and my question would be, you think that is the car going to be the hub, or is your phone in the car going to be the hub? And I think the answer may lie in whether you are interested in Apple, Google, or whoever else is out there doing that. Any impressions on that, though? Car.
Yeah, well, cars, again, big at MWC, everyone seems to have one on their stand, and I think the answer to that question depends on whether you're a car manufacturer or not. If you're a car manufacturer, you absolutely believe the car is going to be the hub. Everyone else believes it's going to be the phone that's the hub, and the car just becomes another source of data for that. And what we're seeing with technologies like CarPlay, which is the Apple solution, or Android Auto, which is Google, and also MirrorLink, which is actually a car-based consortium, is basically replicating what's on your phone on the head unit, the screen on your dashboard. And I think that's the thing that's going to come first of all. That's for entertainment. What we will see, though, is separate to that kind of that consumer-facing thing for navigation, for content, will actually be the connected car in the sense of data coming out of the car engine and all the computers on board, and that will be that the car will sort of be in control of that and will feed that into the smartphone, and there will be apps it's telematics essentially, and that's actually separate to the kind of entertainment or the media integration. And so there's actually there's two facets to most connected cars. I think at the moment most people spend their time talking about media and content and less about the telematics. And I actually think the second one's more interesting because that is the ability to see whether you're going to break down and preventative maintenance, as well as all kinds of fleet tracking logistics in the enterprise space. And because the EU has now mandated a SIM to be included in every new car, that's actually going to happen very quickly indeed.
That's really interesting. Michael, you had a question about 5G, I think. Go ahead and.
Yeah, there's a lot of noise about 5G. In fact, even over here, National Public Radio has been talking a little bit on their marketplace program to get people introduced to the potential of 5G, and they're starting to talk about metrics for performance expectations and stuff. But where are we really? And because it seems to me that we're still it's conceptually. It's a marketing term, but is there a standard, or is there movement towards standardization, or where are we in that curve?
Oh, there's absolutely standards out there, but it's very early days, and I'm not an expert on this particular area, but it was notable that it was kind of one of those buzzwords that was coming up without there being a lot of substance to it. There are the announcements of various trial programs, for example, in Sweden and Japan. They're starting to build the 5G networks, and all the equipment providers, the likes of Ericsson and Nokia, are talking about it. And yes, it is relatively well standardized, but probably need to get someone who's more expert to comment on how far along those are.
The reason I find it curious is that there was some variability. There were ITU standards for what constituted 4G, but they were somewhat hijacked by marketing, at least in the U.S., where all of a sudden HSPA Plus was a 4G standard, which kind of it wasn't really, but
yeah. 3.5G in the US becoming 4G was one of the more interesting marketing descriptions, shall we say. And the same thing's going to happen because there is less of a definitive boundary. But what I would say is most 5G networks are at least 5 years away, and there's an awful lot of advancement still in LTE to come along. If you look at the LTE standards, there's a couple of revisions that have yet to make it into the public. It's far more interesting to talk about those, and those will double or quadruple throughput and bandwidth. And they're going to be absolutely necessary in the next 10 years. I mean, pretty much everyone agrees that mobile bandwidth is going to increase, whether you think it's 8-fold or 20-fold, depends on your model. And actually, it's looking at LTE is probably at the moment more interesting, the future development thing, worrying too much about 5G, and actually then looking at network topography. And so James hinted at this earlier when he was talking about small cells, the idea of kind of more intelligent networks, heterogeneous networks made up of both large cells and small cells, and the mixture of technologies and the handover between different standards. That to me is actually more interesting than getting too obsessed about 5G. But perhaps James could add to that. Now that
now that I'm stationary, not on the train, I'm standing outside the railway station waiting for my lift. Another example of how the network technology is moving on will be the introduction of more devices that support the I-WLAN specification. Now that's a 3GPP, an industry standard, which allows the handsets to work over wireless LAN, a bit like the old UMA that used to be in the BlackBerry handsets. The difference is that these IWLAN is really set up to optimize data, and you can then hand off, it'll automatically hand off from Wi-Fi to LTE and possibly to 3G, whilst maintaining the same data session. That's something that wasn't possible before. It does that by, if you want to really know, by maintaining an IPsec tunnel, so that the external IP address stays the same. So that's new, IWLAN. Apple were the first people to bring out an IWLAN capable phone, but all of the handset manufacturers are leaping in now in a frenzy to try and catch up with Apple. So the new Samsung S6 has got IWLAN. The new Motorola Nexus 6 has got it. The Sony Xperia Z3, I think. Does that sound about right, Rafe?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's actually kind of now standard in the new Qualcomm modems that they've now rebranded them as Snapdragon, I believe, to kind of be in line with their processors. And one of those standards that will actually just appear in every phone within the next 2 years. And yes, the kind of that move towards fixed mobile convergence is very much on the cards, and probably have a bigger impact on consumers than some of the things that we're looking maybe further out.
Okay, something I've picked up which was a little bit annoying, a bit naughty. There's a nasty little Mini just arrived here. You can probably hear it. In fact, you can see it. Look at that. So there's a couple of kids in a little Mini being very noisy. Anyway, something that is a little bit annoying, I picked up. A number of the major manufacturers now are manufacturing a variant of LTE-U. Go away. Noisy. LTE that relies on putting the signaling over licensed spectrum. So you've got licensed spectrum driving the unlicensed spectrum, which kind of defeats the object, I think, because one of the main reasons why you want the unlicensed LTE is because you don't have access to the licensed spectrum. So if you're trying to tie down them so that they're both linked together, it kind of is a bit silly. But that's just an attempt, I think, by the mobile network operators to stop anybody who doesn't have licensed spectrum from getting in on the act. Anyway, I'm burbling because I haven't any sleep for about kind of 20 hours. And Rafe, I have to say that you are remarkably lucid, considering that you've had almost as little sleep as me. But then again, you were asleep on the plane on the way back. I was tempted to take a photograph of you, but I thought I'd better not.
It was very kind that you didn't, because I'm sure I was drooling.
Oh, well, you were a little bit. But you were definitely doing a power nap on that plane, you know.
Well, after about 12 hours sleep in the last 5 days, I have to admit I came back, had a Mars bar, and thought I can get through this.
We really appreciate
Yeah.
you coming in to help us out here, Riff. Let me just make another call for those of you on IRC or on ZipDX, or indeed anywhere. If you can, well, you'd have to.
Or even Carl. Where is Carl these days?
Let's see. No, he's not with us. He's someplace else. But anyway, if anybody has any questions, you type them in, or you unmute yourself with a *6 and shout it out. We'd love to hear from you. And there's several people that I know, that we all know, who are on, for example, on ZipDX. So I'm just chattering so that they can kick the *6. But apparently nobody has any questions. Sounds like it would have been interesting but very tiring event, as you two gentlemen have pretty much shown us.
Well, I have a little bit more of a slightly different subject that I wanted to touch on,
Okay.
which is basically the cloud side of it. Various operators seem to be using or putting things, various what used to be device manufacturers, if you like, various server type device manufacturers are putting everything in the cloud in virtual machines now. How much of that did you see around? I mean, is that the way that everybody's gone? Are we now just in the case that NFV is taking over from everything?
It's a good question. That was, to me, something that was kind of very big last year, and this year MWC, it's assumed that it's happening and it is being talked about, and there were various product announcements being made. I didn't spend a lot of time looking at that particular subject, but this idea that everything should be, as you say, in the cloud or the more software-based networks is something that is definitely apparent. And if you look at some of the equipment providers, the service side of their business is becoming much more important compared to the traditional case where they were very hardware driven. I don't know enough about operators to say if there's sort of a demarcation between the two, but it does tend to be the kind of the emerging markets where the operators are having to grow more quickly, where those things are more popular. Putting those kind of deployments into the existing networks in Western Europe or the States, I think it's something that will take a little bit longer, just because there is kind of more legacy infrastructure and there's a certain amount of technical debt, and a lot of the time these software and cloud services are sold as something brilliant and money saving, and if you're doing a fresh install, absolutely they are, but sometimes it's just easier to continue to build the infrastructure you already have. But it's absolutely is the future, and I think we see that from some of the open source, well, effectively networks that run on open source in places like South Africa, for example, and I expect to see a lot more of that in the future. It's really just a general trend from technology. I don't think it's mobile specific.
Yeah, I know that there are lots of different companies now that are looking at putting things like data centers into what are relatively small boxes and require a huge amount of power, and you go and drop them in the middle of nowhere, and you suddenly have a usable network available to you. Must make an awful lot of difference in various places like in Africa, and indeed in emergency and zones where there are problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think the intelligence around those networks and having more equipment at the edge of the networks is something we're seeing more of, and as you say, in kind of disaster situations, that's where it's very helpful. But also, it's as these networks become expected to deal with greater variety of traffic, and it's not just going to be about the calls and the data going over it. It's the sort of the smart networks that will increasingly, there will be 20 billion connected devices. Now, not all of those will be over cellular, obviously, but the traffic that they're expecting to carry, what they're expected to do is changing. As a result, there are changes in the infrastructure. Yeah, I don't want to go into sort of too much detail because it's not an area I'm a specialist in, but there is an increasing divide at MWC between there's this complaint that the show's getting too big, and there's all these new areas, and say health is one that I was looking at this time round, and there are connected cars and the traditional handsets, But make no mistake, the kind of all the equipment side and the network side is still very much present. It just doesn't get the same attention because it's not as glamorous, even though it has a bigger impact in the long term on our ability to be able to do things.
That's actually affected the way that I've managed to watch what goes on at MWC this week. I mean, I haven't been there. I've been back in the UK. But watching like Mobile World Congress live TV, it's all about consumer stuff. It's rubbish, really.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating, equally being on the ground, because actually trying to find the interesting bits of information has become increasingly difficult. And you'll go around and look for things, and things like the Matrix on the Amdoc stand. You actually have to do a bit of digging before you find out about it, because the focus, and there's a much bigger consumer media presence, and you can read the show daily and sort of get some of the information there, but then hunting down the right people does take a lot of time. And
it's a lot easier, Rafe, if you just go to dinner and sit next to Ahmadine and across the table from Matthew, isn't it?
It is. When you've got someone like James who can basically get you fully briefed over a nice meal, that is by far the best way to do it. Unfortunately, those kind of serendipitous connections don't always happen. It doesn't just fall into your lap. But I did have a good time looking around the kind of GSMA connected city, and just to give you a flavour of some of the things that do go on, one of the demos was actually for an Internet of Things connected pheromone dispenser that farmers put in orchards in order to stop moths eating apples. And that just probably gives you an example of the range of things that you'll see.
Actually, there was some discussion in the Comms Mafia on group on Wire about that, and about how GSMA has kind of lost their way somewhat. And I would hold out that they should look at the American National Association of Broadcasters event, which is of a similar or slightly larger scale, but seems to have maintained its focus as a trade event and not gone completely consumer in its orientation.
Yeah, different people expect to get different things from the event, and actually, really, what's unique about it is have everyone in the mobile world in one place, and it's the meetings that take place, all the stuff that you don't see is actually the real point of MWC. And I think the GSMA as an organisation has a particular political stance to maintain, and mobile as an industry is pretty arrogant in the way that it kind of subsumes other industries and believes it knows best in the way it should talk about things and show things off. Automotive is a good example of that. Actually, you're probably better off going to the Geneva Car Show to find out what's going on in a meaningful way, rather than just the shiny tech demos. I mean, don't get me wrong. You can go and find out about it and meet the right people, but trying to get that signal to noise ratio right is difficult. And I think the GSMA is struggling because it always used to be mobile had to prove its existence, and now there's an assumption that mobile is present everywhere. It just is, and it's the dominant form of technology. There are 2 billion smartphones out there, and people really don't understand what that scale really means at the moment, because it touches on pretty much everything.
This has really been fantastic, Rafe. Really appreciate you being here, because James would have been able to probably say a lot of interesting things, but he dropped in and out, and that's kind of an ironic note to the fact that here this huge big deal about Mobile World Conference, but in a first world country, and I have the same here. I'm in France, and we have terrific LTE, even in a relatively small city of Bordeaux. I have a really good LTE, depending on where I am. But when I'm on a train, I mean, you're in the countryside. Sometimes you got Edge, sometimes you have a little bit of 3G, but mostly there's no connectivity of any kind. And this is a problem. Let's face it. In the third world, it's a really sketchy thing. In other words, you got no data and probably no phone, and yet they have no phone lines. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma we have.
That's right. I mean, it's why I always say when I'm asked about this, you have to follow the hybrid model. Don't expect to have ubiquitous connectivity. I mean, the other solution is everyone moves to Finland, which has pretty much perfect network connectivity, but there's good reasons for that. I mean, the UK has been stymied by kind of the 3G auction licenses, which took a lot of money out of the network infrastructure. Things should improve with 4G, but yeah, I mean, the GSMA is very proud of saying that more people have access to a mobile network signal than have access to electricity, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot of spots in between where it's not very good, and there's still, I think, a lot of work to do. And you know, where I spend a lot of time in rural East Sussex, there's only a single operator works, and it's just a 2G signal. Here in London, it's actually pretty good, and I have 4G everywhere I go, but I'm very aware of that issue, and I think actually more awareness of that would be good, simply because most of the testing takes place in, you know, there's this assumption of ubiquitous connectivity, and where it is becoming more fundamental to, you know, the way we expect to do things, actually that becomes a very serious problem. You will get this kind of urban-rural divide, and it's not exactly giving me nightmares, but it does give me pause for thought.
And I think also that we're going to see in the very near future that trains and planes, well, we already see it on planes, Wi-Fi, but trains, which are, you know, there's many, I assume, more traffic on, well, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but the point is when I take a train, there is no chance to have strong Wi-Fi, but I think that in the next year or two or three, that is going to become a reality in most markets. You'll probably have to pay for it, but it will be there. So you'll have Wi-Fi rather than 3 or 4G, but it'll exist and it'll be an option. It's already an option on planes. However, for the person who's out there, you know, farming or on the tractor, it's going to be wireless, and that is very hard to invest for the 20 people who care about it, right?
Yeah, and that's why, you know, we have so much government regulation in the UK around kind of fibre and that kind of broadband, and equally well in the kind of obligations that the 4G licensees are expected to meet. There are some new technologies. I mean, Sigvox was displaying their stuff at MWC, and this is kind of a network that's designed for Internet of Things. That's very interesting. It's worth checking out if you're kind of interested in that. It's very low bandwidth. It's just intended to send small amounts of data back, and can actually achieve pretty good coverage with just a handful of base stations across the country. Yeah, I agree. It is an issue that the industry is going to have to face.
Let me just ask you to finish up here, Rafe, while I'm trying to find my, here we go, my music to take us out. Do you have anything you'd like to announce? Are you speaking any place, or is there any events or anything at all, websites, anything you would like to tell people?
Sure. Well, I guess I should, on behalf of my employer, say I'm at Digitas LBI. I'm a mobile strategist there. It's a big technology agency in London. If you're interested in what I have to say about mobile, also check out 361podcast.com, where I do a weekly podcast around mobile topics in general with friends Ben Smith and Ewan McLeod. And I'd love to hear what people think about that, and sort of download a couple of episodes and let me know. There will be some MWC related content in the next few weeks.
Well, look for that. Again, thank you very much. Let me make sure that nobody else has any parting comments. By the way, Jim, our friend Jim in IRC, who's been talking about BlackBerry and a lot of other things, would like to also say that you did a great job, Rafe.
Oh, thank you very much.
Anyone else? Michael, Andy, James is no longer with us. No, nobody has anything. If not, we're going to launch the outro music, and thank everybody for joining us. Okay, Rafe, come on back.
I look forward to it. I will do.
All right, great. And I'm going to look up your podcast and listen to it. It should be great. Thank you, everybody. Hey, that was the bleeding edge of the IP communications and VoIP community. We're at vuc.me on the web. Thanks to simwood.com, who can turn you as a developer into a telco. Our hosted PBX is provided by onsip.com. The site at vuc.me is on bluehost.com. We use zipdx.com for our wideband, full-featured conference bridge. And our local rate dial-ins are from voxbone.com. Every Friday, 12 noon Eastern Time. See you next week.